Stranger yells at Barron Trump in a cafe. How he handles it changes everyone's perspective. It was a quiet winter evening in rural Pennsylvania. Snow blanketed the streets, muffling the usual hum of the small town. Inside a worn but cozy cafe, locals sipped their drinks, escaping the biting cold outside. At a corner table, Donald Trump sat alone, reading a folded newspaper. The space felt intimate, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. People noticed him but kept their distance. His presence carried an unusual weight, a blend of curiosity, admiration, and lingering resentment. The bell above the door jingled sharply, cutting through the subdued murmur. A woman in her 40s, wrapped in a thick coat, stepped inside, her face pale and tense. Rachel scanned the room, her hands clutching something. A photograph. Her eyes locked on Trump, and her expression twisted into one of pain and resolve. Rachel walked briskly to his table. The cafe fell silent as the townsfolk turned to watch. She stopped in front of him, her voice trembling as she held out the photograph. "This is my father," she said, her tone catching between grief and anger. The picture showed an older man in a military uniform, smiling proudly. "He believed in you. He defended you, and he died waiting for the VA hospital bed you promised." Trump lowered his paper slowly. His face remained unreadable, but his gaze shifted to the photograph. He didn't speak, and the silence stretched unbearably. Rachel's voice cracked, but she pressed on. "My father, Edward Harper, a decorated veteran. He served in Vietnam, came home to a factory job, and worked himself to the bone. When the factories closed, he didn't give up. But when he needed help, when we needed help, there was nothing." Her words were sharp, but the pain behind them was unmistakable. She laid a stack of papers on the table. Hospital bills, letters to the VA, appeals that went unanswered. "He believed in your promises. He said you'd remember men like him, but you didn't. He died forgotten." The room felt heavy. Other patrons exchanged glances, their own struggles mirrored in Rachel's story. A few veterans in the cafe shifted uncomfortably, their faces hard but their eyes betraying recognition. Trump studied the photograph and then the bills. His usual bravado was absent. For a moment, he looked tired. "What's his story?" he asked quietly, lifting the photo. Rachel hesitated, caught off guard by his tone. She sat down across from him, her movements stiff with tension. "My dad was everything to us," she began. "He taught me to work hard, to respect others, to never give up. Even when his health started failing, he kept defending you. He'd tell anyone who'd listen, 'Trump's going to fix it. He'll make it right.'" Her voice wavered. But he waited and waited until there was no time left. Across the cafe, a man in a faded jacket stood up. "My brother's waiting too," he said, his voice low, "for 2 years now." Another veteran, this one in his 70s, added, "My wife handles the paperwork. It's like shouting into the wind." Rachel looked around, her father's photo still clutched in her hand. She wasn't alone. Trump leaned back in his chair, his expression solemn. "I won't make excuses," he said. "The system's broken. It has been for a long time." Rachel's frustration flared. "That's all you've got? No excuses? My dad deserved more than that." "I agree," Trump said simply. His directness disarmed her momentarily. He leaned forward, holding her father's photo with surprising care. "I grew up hearing about men like your father. My uncle was in the service. He always said that America owes its soul to people like them. I believed it then. I believe it now." Rachel's anger ebbed slightly, replaced by a flicker of something softer, but the weight of her loss remained. "Believing isn't enough," she said, her voice quieter now. Another voice broke in. "He's right, though," said the elderly veteran. "The system's been failing us for decades. Presidents come and go, but nothing changes." The conversation shifted. One by one, other veterans began sharing their stories. The man in the faded jacket spoke of his brother, a Gulf War veteran battling PTSD without proper care. The elderly man shared how his son, also a veteran, had to sell their family home to afford treatments the VA wouldn't cover. The cafe transformed into a space of raw, shared pain. Rachel listened, her anger softening into a profound sadness. These weren't just her struggles, they were everyone's. The cafe was no longer a place of quiet retreat. It had become a space where the unspoken pains of veterans and their families spilled out like an unhealed wound. Rachel sat stiffly across from Trump, her father's photo still resting between them on the table. Around them, the veterans' voices grew louder, each story adding weight to the room's already heavy air. A woman in her 60s, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee cup, spoke up. "My husband died last year. Agent Orange exposure. He fought for this country, and in the end, he fought harder to get someone to care." Her voice broke, and a man next to her patted her shoulder in silent solidarity. Rachel's frustration began to shift. She wasn't the only one. Her dad wasn't the only one. Trump listened, his face serious but calm. "I hear you," he said, looking around the room. "Every one of you. I'm not here to defend what's broken. I know that system failed you." A younger veteran in a baseball cap crossed his arms. "It's easy to say that now, isn't it? But where were you when we needed you?" His tone was sharp, cutting through the heavy air. Trump nodded, unflinching. "You're right. Words won't fix it. I can't undo what's happened. But I want to understand more. Your voices, your stories, they matter." Rachel's brows furrowed. "What good is understanding if nothing changes? My dad didn't need understanding. He needed a bed, treatment, dignity." Trump leaned forward, his gaze steady. "What did your dad teach you, Rachel?" The question caught her off guard. "What?" she asked, her voice softening. "You said he taught you to work hard, to respect others, to never give up," Trump said. "And you've honored that by being here, by fighting for him even now. That's not nothing. That's everything." Rachel looked at the photo again, her father's proud smile staring back at her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "He deserved better," she whispered. Trump nodded. "He did, and so do all of you." A silence fell over the cafe, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of before. It was thoughtful, reflective. People exchanged glances, some nodding quietly. The elderly veteran who had spoken earlier cleared his throat. "If nothing else, we need to remind each other we're not alone. We've been through too much, and it's easy to forget that." Rachel looked around the room, seeing the shared pain etched on every face. For the first time that night, her anger gave way to something else: resolve. Trump spoke again, his tone quieter. "I won't pretend to have all the answers, but I can listen, and I can take what I hear and make sure it gets to the right people. That's a promise I can make right now." The young veteran in the baseball cap leaned against the counter, his expression softening. "You better mean it," he said, his voice low. "I do," Trump said firmly. The cafe settled into an uneasy quiet as Trump's words lingered in the air. Rachel looked around, her eyes meeting those of other patrons. It wasn't just her father's story being told anymore, it was everyone's. The collective weight of shared pain and frustration hung heavily over the room. A younger man, barely in his 30s, stood up from a table near the window. His jacket bore a patch marking his service in Afghanistan. "You know what makes me mad?" he asked, his voice raw. "It's not just the broken promises. It's the fact that we gave everything for this country, and when we come home, we're treated like we don't matter." He looked directly at Trump. "You say you hear us now, but what about then? When my buddy lost both his legs and got stuck in a 2-year wait for prosthetics? When I had to sell my truck to pay for therapy because the VA wouldn't cover it?" Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. His words echoed her father's struggles and her own resentment. She saw her reflection in his anger, a mirror of what she had been feeling when she walked into the cafe. Trump met the man's gaze evenly. "I can't change what you've been through," he said, his voice measured. "But I can tell you this: your sacrifices matter, and they should have mattered more to the people in charge, including me. The man didn't respond immediately. He crossed his arms, his jaw tight, but he stayed standing. It was clear he was weighing Trump's words. Rachel broke the silence. "We've all heard promises before," she said, her voice steady. "What makes this different? What makes anything you say here tonight mean more than empty words?" Trump leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "Because I'm not here to make promises tonight. I'm here to listen. And if what you're saying doesn't make its way into the system, then I've failed again." The elderly veteran from earlier nodded. "Listening's a start," he said quietly. "It's more than most people bother to do." The younger man sat down, but the tension in the room didn't fully dissipate. Instead, it shifted into something more introspective. The stories continued, each one building on the last. Rachel shared more about her father. "He didn't just believe in you, he believed in this country. Even when things got hard, he'd say, 'We're all in this together.' I think that's what hurts the most. He always thought we'd find a way to fix things. He didn't live long enough to see it." Her voice cracked and she paused, taking a shaky breath. Trump's gaze softened. "Your father's belief wasn't misplaced. It's people like him who hold this country together. It's people like you." Across the room, a woman with a baby on her hip spoke up. "My husband's still waiting for his appeal to go through," she said. "It's been 3 years. He doesn't say much about it, but I can see what it's doing to him. It's like the system's forgotten him." Rachel looked at the woman, feeling an unexpected connection. "I used to feel the same way," she admitted. "Like my dad was invisible to everyone but us. But he wasn't. Not really. We're here telling his story. That means something, doesn't it?" The woman nodded, her grip on her child tightening slightly. Trump looked around the room, his expression contemplative. "You're all here because you care," he said. "You care enough to fight, to keep pushing even when the system pushes back. That's not invisible. That's strength." The younger veteran leaned forward in his chair. "Strength doesn't pay bills," he muttered. "No, it doesn't," Trump admitted. "But it does build something bigger. It builds community. It builds change. That's why you're all here tonight." Rachel felt a pang of something she hadn't expected. Hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. She glanced down at her father's photo, her thumb brushing the edge of the worn paper. For the first time in years, she thought, maybe he wasn't forgotten after all. The cafe remained still, the air thick with the weight of shared stories. Rachel sat quietly, her father's photo still lying between her and Trump. The fragile hope she had felt moments ago began to intertwine with lingering doubt. Could anything truly change? Could the grief and struggles of so many people ever be rectified? A man sitting near the counter spoke, his voice breaking through the silence. "I want to believe this means something," he said. He was older, with deep lines etched across his face. "But I've seen too many of us get lost in the cracks. My wife used to say, 'The system isn't broken, it's just not made for us.' And I think she was right." Rachel turned toward him. "So, what do we do?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with desperation. "Do we just keep telling stories and hope someone listens? Or do we fight harder? Because it feels like fighting just drains us more." Trump leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You fight," he said firmly. "But you don't fight alone. That's the difference." Rachel met his gaze, her skepticism still evident. "And what about you? What are you going to do with what you're hearing tonight?" Trump exhaled deeply, glancing down at the photo on the table. "I don't have an answer for that yet," he admitted. "But I can promise you this. I won't forget what I've heard tonight. And I'll make sure the people who can change things won't forget it either." The younger veteran, still leaning back in his chair, smirked. "That's a nice sentiment," he said, his tone biting. "But words don't fix this mess. Action does." Trump nodded, unshaken. "You're right," he replied. "Words mean nothing without action. But action starts with listening, understanding, and making sure the right people are involved. And that's why I'm here, to start." Rachel looked around the cafe, her gaze lingering on the faces of the other patrons. The young mother clutching her baby, the elderly man with weary eyes, the veterans who had shared their stories. All of them carried the weight of lives shaped by hardship. And yet, they were here, still speaking, still hoping. Her own voice, quieter now, broke the momentary silence. "Maybe my dad was right to believe," she said. "Not just in you, but in all of us. He always said change doesn't come from one person. It comes from everyone refusing to give up." The elderly veteran from earlier nodded in agreement. "That's what they don't tell you when you sign up," he said. "That the fight doesn't end when the war does. It keeps going here at home. But Rachel's right. We don't give up." Trump's expression softened as he listened. He wasn't used to being quiet for so long, but tonight it felt necessary. These people weren't just venting. They were laying bare the truth of lives lived in struggle and resilience. The young mother suddenly stepped forward, cradling her baby in one arm and holding out a crumpled piece of paper in the other. "This is my husband's appeal," she said, her voice trembling. "It's been sitting in a pile somewhere for years. If you really want to help, start with this." Trump took the paper, studying it for a moment before folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket. "I will," he said, his tone resolute. The act seemed small, almost insignificant, but in the context of that room, it was monumental. The people in the cafe began to shift, some leaning back in their chairs, others exchanging quiet words. The tension that had filled the room was giving way to something more subdued, a cautious optimism. Rachel leaned back, exhaling slowly. She looked at her father's photo one last time before tucking it back into her coat. "He would have liked this," she murmured, almost to herself. "People coming together, not just complaining, but trying to make things better." Trump glanced at her, his gaze steady. "He sounds like a man worth remembering." Rachel nodded, her eyes glistening. He was. Across the room, the younger veteran raised his coffee cup in a small, almost hesitant toast. "To those worth remembering," he said quietly. The cafe, one by one, followed suit. Cups were raised, some with murmured words, others in silent tribute. Rachel found herself lifting her own cup, the gesture feeling like both an ending and a beginning. The cafe was no longer just a place for coffee and warmth on a winter evening. It had become a gathering of voices, a mosaic of shared pain and resilience. As the quiet toast settled, Rachel felt an unexpected sense of closure, though her heart still carried the weight of her father's absence. She looked across the table at Trump, who was staring at the folded appeal paper in his hands. His expression was unreadable, yet thoughtful. The younger veteran, who had been the most skeptical, broke the silence. "All right," he said, leaning forward. "If you're serious about listening, prove it. What are you going to do with everything you've heard tonight?" Trump looked up, meeting the veteran's challenging gaze. His voice was steady but subdued. "I'll do what I can," he began, "but I won't stand here and make promises I can't keep. That would be insulting to all of you." The veteran raised an eyebrow. "That's not much of an answer." Rachel, feeling a sudden need to bridge the tension, spoke up. "Sometimes it's not about what's said, it's about what's done after." She turned to Trump. "What can you do? Right now?" Trump nodded, as if he had been waiting for that question. He pulled out the appeal paper the young mother had handed him earlier and placed it on the table. "This," he said, tapping the paper gently, "I can make sure this doesn't sit forgotten. I can make sure someone pays attention. That's where it starts." The cafe grew quiet again as the weight of his words settled in. They weren't grandiose and they didn't promise sweeping change, but they were tangible, something real. The elderly veteran, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. "It's not about fixing everything at once," he said. "It's about making sure no one feels invisible anymore." Trump nodded. "Exactly. If tonight's taught me anything, it's that the system isn't just broken, It's left people like you out in the cold. That's not what this country is supposed to be about." Rachel looked around the room, seeing nods of agreement. For the first time, the divide between Trump and the cafe patrons seemed smaller. He wasn't just a figurehead anymore, he was someone who was listening, even if imperfectly. The young mother who had handed over the appeal stepped closer. "If you can start with my husband," she said, her voice wavering, "then maybe others will get the help they need too. That's all I want, to see something change." Trump met her eyes. "Then I'll start with him." The room felt lighter, as if a collective burden had been eased, if only slightly. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her fingers brushing over her father's photo in her pocket. She thought of his words, the ones he had repeated so often. "We're all in this together." For the first time, they felt like more than just an ideal. They felt like a possibility. The cafe began to empty as the snow outside thickened, muffling the sounds of the town. Patrons slowly bundled up, exchanging small nods and quiet goodbyes. The stories shared that evening hung in the air like an unspoken promise, a commitment to remember and to act. Rachel lingered at her seat, watching as Trump folded the appeal paper and carefully placed it in his coat pocket. He stood and turned to the remaining patrons. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "For trusting me with your stories tonight. I'll make sure they're not forgotten." The young veteran in the baseball cap gave him a short nod. "You've got a lot to prove," he said simply. His tone was no longer sharp, just honest. Trump nodded in return. "I know." Rachel rose from her seat, her father's photo still clutched in her hand. She hesitated, then stepped closer to Trump. "He would have wanted me to say thank you," she said softly. "Not for what you've done, but for what you might still do." He believed in people, even when it wasn't easy. Trump's expression softened as he looked at her. "Then I won't let him down." She smiled faintly, tucking the photo back into her coat. "Neither will I." As Rachel stepped toward the door, the young mother with the baby caught her arm gently. "Thank you for speaking up," the mother said. "You made it easier for the rest of us." Rachel glanced at her, surprised. I didn't know what else to do." "That's enough," the mother replied with a warm smile. "Sometimes just showing up is enough." Outside, the snow continued to fall, its quiet persistence a reminder of time moving forward. Rachel paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the soft glow of the streetlights. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "We're all in this together." For the first time in years, she truly believed it. Behind her, the cafe door swung open and Trump stepped out. He glanced at her and nodded once before heading to his car. Rachel watched him go, unsure of what the future held but comforted by the fact that tonight had mattered. For her, for the others in the cafe, and maybe even for him. As she turned to walk home, she thought of her father, not as a man who had been failed by the system, but as someone whose legacy of hope and resilience had brought strangers together. His memory, she realized, wasn't just hers to carry. It belonged to all of them now. The snow crunched softly under her boots as she walked away, her heart a little lighter.